Welcome to The Breakup Theory, conversations on ending things and collective liberation. Today I'm re-releasing a conversation I recorded for the Final Straw Radio with Joshua Clover. Our conversation focuses around his 2016 book, Riot, Strike, Riot, in part within the context of the George Floyd rebellion that happened a few years later, in 2020. I wanted to present this conversation in memoriam of Joshua, who we learned last week had died. As many of the testimonials you can find online say, Joshua is a great friend and comrade to a wide range of people. He's remembered not just as a poet and an academic thinker, but also as someone ready to throw down in the streets. I didn't know him, really, beyond his work and this conversation, but I appreciated the depth of his thinking and his willingness to go into it with me. I am re-releasing this episode in its entirety as it was originally put out by the Final Straw Radio. I wanted to do so in order to suggest to anyone who has not listened to the show to check it out further. This is an essential long-running anarchist podcast that presents conversations with people involved in many different struggles, a necessary tool for us to figure out how to form international solidarities. It also engages with anarchist writing and culture. It's a unique, wide-ranging breadth of subjects. They gave me a chance to dig into complex conversations with writers and people on the ground and got me started. I highly recommend checking them out and digging into their past episodes as well. They produce transcript zines of many of their conversations, too. You can find them on all the podcasting platforms or at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.com. Both The Final Straw and The Breakup Theory are part of the anarchist network of podcasts Channel Zero Network. This is another resource for so much great anarchist work. To find more conversations like these, plus totally different approaches, go to channelzeronetwork.com. And just a side note, I've been away for a while, but I have new shows to release and plan to start posting again regularly. As of May 12th, I'll be moving all of my writing to my new collaborative project, CAW, C-A-W, an online journal of autonomous writing and culture. This is a writers' collective formed by me, Carla Joy Bergman, Danny Burleson, and Vicky Osterweil. It will be a subscription-based service to help support us in devoting more time to our work. In addition to articles, essays, interviews, we have an advice column and a free library of zines and stickers, and we'll be hosting workshops and reading groups. Check us out and subscribe at cawshinythings.com, cawshinythings.com. Now, my conversation on the Final Straw Radio with Joshua Clover.
Airing first on Asheville FM, WSFM LP 103.3 FM in Asheville, North Carolina, this is The Final Straw, a weekly anarchist anti-authoritarian radio show broadcasting from occupied Jaligi land in southern Appalachia. We bring you voices and perspectives from people, projects, and struggles around the world engaging in the long project toward liberation. You can email us with questions or suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net or at protonmail.com, and send us letters at P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina 28816. This show is brought to you by Firestorm Books, located at 610 Haywood Road. Firestorm is a locally owned cooperative specializing in offbeat, underground, and independent literature. You can find a sample of Firestorm's catalog plus a full calendar of events at their website, firestorm.coop. So this week we are very pleased to present Scott's interview with Joshua Clover, who is the author of 7 books, including Riot, Strike, Riot, which has been translated into 6 languages, and the forthcoming book Roadrunner from Duke University Press. Our guest says that this book is exactly about what you think it's about, but if you're not familiar with or from Boston, or haven't ever seen a Stop and Shop at midnight from the Beltway, it's about placing one particular song from one particular band within a wide and fascinating context. This will be out in September.
First, a very brief announcement. David L. McKay, who is being charged because of his participation in last summer's George Floyd uprisings in Philadelphia, needs money to hire a new attorney. Currently, his public defender is trying to get him to snitch on other defendants to benefit his own case, and David wants no part of that. So you can learn more about his case, how to write him support letters, and how to donate to him getting a new lawyer by visiting gofund.me/53F as in Frank, 3, D as in dog, D as in dog, B as in boy, and the number 1. That's gofund.me/53F3DDB1.
And now, without further ado, here is the interview.
So you published Riot, Strike, Riot in 2016, and if anything, it seems like the last 5 years have really borne out your analysis in many ways, and that made me really excited to get to talk to you to hear about your perspective over the last 5 years of global uprisings. And so jumping into that, I wanted to set up the terms of analysis that you put forth in the book so we can get an understanding of the historical trajectory you trace and then the theory of riot that you propose, which I think is super important for us right now. So the historical context you focus on is broadly the time of industrial capitalism to now, the onset of industrial capitalism, with a dialectic you propose of transformation in popular resistance from riot to strike to a new or a changed form of riot, which you call riot prime. You define strike and riot as different forms, and I'm going to quote you: strike and riot are practical struggles over reproduction within production and circulation, respectively. So I was wondering if you could go a bit into the distinction and the texture of the two forms of riot and strike, the different terrain they use, the different relation to time and space, or what it means to struggle for reproduction, the terrain of circulation as opposed to production.
So this is the big ticket theoretical question, and I'll try to answer it without dodging theory, but in a way that tries to make it sort of useful and accessible in relation to particulars, which is one of the goals of the book, is to have a sort of theoretical apparatus that can be meaningfully descriptive of concrete events that we've lived through and our friends have lived through and people we know have lived through. Speaking of that, the publication history that you mentioned, even more strikingly, the original talk that this came out of, where I started working through these concepts, was from 2012. So before, for example, the Ferguson uprising. And that was something that happened while I was puzzling through the book, and I could see immediately that it was super important. And I got myself to Ferguson as quickly as I could and tried to be involved in what happened there and talk to people and so on. And that was sort of the first, I don't know if confirmation is the right word. It's hard to think of that dramatic a political episode as like, oh, well, good, it confirmed my theories. But it was certainly a moment where I felt like the things I was trying to think about and what was happening in the world and the United States were converging pretty dramatically. So to get back to the theoretical sort of framework, so the circuit of capital in its entirety has these two interlocking spheres. And one of them is the sphere of production. That's the place where capitalists bring together means of production, right? So if you make clothes, you're bringing together textiles and sewing machines and needles and a factory and electricity, and bring that together with workers, with labor power, and you make a commodity. And that's the sphere of production. And then the commodity is launched out onto the market. It sort of makes its way to the marketplace, is exchanged, it's exchanged some more, it's consumed. That's all the sphere of circulation. Mm-hmm. So those two spheres are, as I said, interlinked, and neither can exist without the other. But interestingly, almost everyone in the world is in the sphere of circulation. That is to say, we're what we call market dependent. We have to go to the store to get food or clothes or whatever that we need to survive. Whereas only some fraction of the world is dependent directly, at least, on wages in production for survival. So those are the two different sort of moments in which we reproduce ourselves, our families, our communities. And here I don't mean biological reproduction, right? I mean that whatever you do to be alive the next day as a person, as a community. And so, you know, if you have a wage, if you have a formal employment, as we say, often you struggle in production. So you struggle over the value of your labor. That's what a strike is, right? That's not the only kind of production struggle. That's not the only way people struggle there. They do all kinds of stuff. They do sabotage and factory takeovers and who knows. But Those are production struggles. But let's imagine you don't have formal employment, you don't have access to the wage, but still you're pretty miserable. Your life is pretty immiserated enough that you decide you want to fight back against that misery. Well, you're not going to struggle in production because you can't, but you are out there in the space of circulation. You are still market dependent. And so that's the other sort of large category of struggle that I look at in the book and that I focus on, which is circulation struggles more broadly. So often historically, these were over the price of market goods, right? So if you go back to even before industrial capitalism, the 16th, 17th, 18th century, you get these what get called riots that are persistently over the price and availability of market goods. So famously, the bread riot, which a lot of people think of as like going down to the baker and liberating the bread, but even more commonly took the form of blocking the road and stopping grain merchants from shipping grain out of your county to somewhere else where they could make a higher profit because people in your county are hungry. And they're like, fuck that, the grain stays here, we need food. So that's sort of the origin of the circulation struggle, of which the riot is the most famous kind, but again, not the only kind. We can think about the blockade and the occupation, various other kinds of things. And that is the form that comes before the strike, which rises to prominence as the main form of production struggle, as you say, with industrial capitalism in the early, middle 19th century. By the late 20th century, and here I'm really talking about the early industrializing nations, sometimes called the capitalist core. By the late 20th century, the strike and the historical labor movement has started to recede pretty dramatically, in fact, while the riot begins to return to prominence, so much so that when we talk about major political struggles in the West over the last several decades, most regularly we're talking about versions of riots, from the small local event to the George Floyd uprising. So those are the two categories of struggle: production struggle and circulation struggle, and their relationship to those two sort of spheres of capital. I hope that wasn't too extended a framework, but once we have that, we can maybe get more down to practical events that we've all lived through.
No, yeah, that's really helpful and kind of breaks it down in a way that makes sense. Well, one of the things that you do in the book that I find really interesting is you sort of look at the way that riot and strike have been put into opposition as like opposed political actions. And this like happens on all kind of spectrums of the political ideology, like left and right, or even just in popular representation, where riot is seen as like a non-political act, it's delegitimized. And strike is seen as maybe more worthy, at least certain versions of the strike, and gets kind of like put in the like toolkit of like peaceful protest, etc., as a legitimate way to get what you want politically. But there's also distinctions that we can see in how they bring down repression from the state. But what you do in the book is to show how these two forms of struggle have continuities and therefore are like more tied to historical moments rather than an essential difference. So I was wondering if you could kind of talk about that seeming opposition of riot and strike and where you think that they kind of connect and differ from your perspective.
Yeah, that's a really helpful question. And I think it has, for me, two important pivots in it. And one is to think about the continuity between riot and strike that's often obscured. And the other is to think about their historicity or historicality. I'm never quite sure of the technical term. So the first thing I'll say is that the strike originally arises very much out of circulation, a circulation of goods. The earliest use of the term strike has to do with sailors on boats that are delivering goods refusing to deliver and striking their sails, as it's called, right? Taking down the sails and waiting and refusing to deliver goods. So that's clearly in the space of transport of goods to market, which sort of arises from the category of circulation struggles and that sort of era of merchants. But it's the beginning of the strike. So the strike really arises out of these moments of circulation and then becomes a kind of production struggle. And then, as noted, the tide shifts the other way back toward the riot in, I think, it's hard to pin down dates, and I may have been overly specific in the book, but I don't know, 60s, 70s, somewhere in there. So two things, right? One is that continuity, that it's not like anyone invented the strike because they were like, nah, man, the riot's no good. Don't do a riot. Like it didn't work that way historically. That opposition that arrives fairly late in the game. One emerges from the other in this real historical continuity, but as you suggested really helpfully, they rise and fall and ebb and flow in relation to historical conditions. Again, like some sort of, as we say, trans-historical idea that like X form of struggle is good, Y form of struggle is bad. Anytime you hear someone saying that to you, you should just say, well, that's nonsense. The kind of struggle that's going to emerge, whatever our sort of theoretical or moral judgments of it, the kind of struggle that's going to emerge is going to emerge from concrete situations. So when you have a massive increase of industrialization, the rise of the factory, the expansion of the formal wage, of course you're going to get increases in people struggling that way. And when that mode of organizing society starts to recede with deindustrialization, sort of disemployment, production of surplus populations at a global level, and I'm sure we'll get to that technical term, surplus populations, then of course struggles in the sphere of circulation, where people who've been sort of kicked out of employment via automation or offshoring or whatever, but still are stuck in the sphere of circulation, well, they're going to keep struggling. And my one great lesson that I've learned in thinking about these things is that it's simple. I apologize for my simplicity, right? But it's just people struggle where they are, period. People run up against misery and they decide they don't want to take it. They don't want to take being bullied by their boss. They don't want to take being unable to afford to survive. They don't want to take being killed by the cops. And they struggle where they are. And if you get a lot of people in production, you're going to see production struggles. And if you get a lot of people in circulation, you're going to see circulation struggles. It's pretty straightforward, actually.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, so like kind of drawing off the way that maybe the history is told to us and the way that it plays out in our imaginations. And perhaps this has to do with the fact that the strike kind of came about also at the times that these different kinds of liberationist ideologies of like anarchism and communism were coming out. But the strike plays a kind of like outscaled role in our imaginations of what like revolutionary struggle means. And the sense I got reading your book is like because you go riot, strike, riot, prime. The strike almost seems like an aberration in terms of its concentration of kind of like movement power, and that at least today I see that like the romanticization of the strike seems to kind of exceed its effectiveness. Like people still think that's where we need to be doing our work, but it doesn't really quite make sense. So I was wondering if you had thoughts about why the strike commands so much power over revolutionary imaginations. And then, I mean, there's also kind of poetry to the riot, of course. So, I just wonder if you want to talk about that and like the imaginative power of these forms of struggle.
Yeah, well, this is a great and complex, rich question, I think. And, I hope you're right that the strike will seem like an aberration, by which I mean, not that I bear the strike any ill will, but I hope that human history endures long enough that we look back on the 150-year period where the strike oriented a lot of struggles in a lot of the world as an aberration. I'm worried that human history is not going to last that long, that we won't have a chance to look back on that as an aberration. But I think you raise an important point, right? Which is that it is a fairly clearly bracketed period. And so why did it take on the intense charisma that it did? And I think there's good reasons for it, to be honest. Certainly, when the strike was on the rise, there was a belief, and a not unreasonable one, that the sort of move toward an industrial society, manufacturing society, was just going to continue. That it was going to sort of cover more and more of the globe, that it was going to organize more and more of people's lives, that it was going to organize more and more of social production. And so the belief was that the labor movement, when it came into being, which, we have our first strikes in the late 18th century. We have the first Workers' Party officially in the 1870s in Germany. And at that point, it's on, right? The labor movement is sort of where the action is in the West, at least. And the sense was this would just continue to expand. And people thought that for a good reason. So it didn't really turn out to be the case. It lasted for a while and not forever. But during the period of the labor movement's expansion and consolidation, it won a lot of really tremendous victories. The strike, especially when there's high labor demand, is an incredibly powerful weapon. And sometimes people read the book as an advocacy book saying, oh, you should riot, not strike, which it absolutely is not. It never once suggests that. And the strike, in certain but not at all uncommon situations, is incredibly powerful. It won a lot of victories. It seemed like it was a route not just to better compensation and conditions for workers, but maybe to overcome capitalism. And for those reasons, it acquired a lot of charisma. So much so that I'm sure, as you've noticed, people love to call things strikes now. They just aren't strikes, right? They don't involve withdrawing labor. They don't involve interfering with capitalist production, but people will call them strikes because that term has a lot of charisma. Two things. One, it deserves that charisma for the victories that it won. Mm-hmm. Two, I think people who are going to struggle get to call what they're doing whatever they want. If someone wakes up in the morning and is ready to go out and really try and fight against power as it exists, I salute them, and they should get to call what they're doing whatever the fuck they want. That said, I do think or hope that we'll live long enough to see the charisma of the strike wane a little. It hasn't been nearly so powerful. It hasn't won nearly the gains it used to win since the 70s or 80s. And meanwhile, other forms of struggle are coming to the fore. I think there was probably even a time a few years ago, like just 6 years ago, 8 years ago, when people were still sort of saying, well, the riot's illegitimate, it's not a real form of struggle, the strike is the only real form of struggle. At this point, I think it's only like hardline workerists, as we say, who hold to that position. After the George Floyd uprising last summer, I think people are more ready to recognize that these other forms of social contest can really become a challenge to the present social order.
Right. Yeah, that's an interesting point, just to see how that tide has shifted from just last year, where I think you hear less people kind of talking about what we need to do is like organize workplaces.
Yeah, I mean, I think if I can just intercede for a second, I think you use the word organize, and that's really a crucial pivot here. So one of the reasons that the strike feels so politically powerful to people is because of a fairly narrow definition of what counts as organization, right? And so they always say, well, you have to be organized. And often that just means organized like a union, organized like a political party. And so the strike satisfies that, and a riot or uprising insurrection does not. And people say, well, it'll never work, it's not organized. Now that's rubbish. There's lots of other kinds of organization that go into an uprising, a riot. Robin D.G. Kelley, the great historian, has written eloquently about the kinds of organizing that small social groups in Los Angeles did in advance of the Watts riots in 1965 that made it possible. Now, these small social groups often get called street gangs, but they're community groups, right? That get together and figure out how to proceed from day to day. And they did a lot of organizing, but it's not the kind that gets recognized by like, we need to organize. So that's exactly the hinge, I think, is understanding what counts as organization as we think about political possibilities.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And we could probably draw a comparison to like the George Floyd uprisings. The massiveness of them came, in the heat of the pandemic, when there had been mutual aid groups working in all these cities to try and take care of people while they were losing work and losing access to the things they need to live. So in some way, that kind of organization, which doesn't get recognized in the same way like a party or a union does, was there at the same time that people started reacting to, the continuous murder of Black people by the police. And that may have helped provide a kind of like leverage for the size of the movement. So that's an interesting parallel that you draw from Kelley. In terms of this, the way that you describe the predicament of the strike today is really helpful for me to think about why it seems less successful. You call it the affirmation trap. And this seems to me actually to be super helpful just in thinking about the kind of about capitalism and what it produces in terms of how we can even imagine our lives and struggle. That you say that all that workers can really struggle for is to reaffirm their position within capitalist exploitation. And that's like a game of diminishing returns. I wonder if you could just kind of talk about this affirmation trap and explain like that larger arc of capitalist accumulation and financialization that leads to this narrowing of the purview of the strike?
Yeah, absolutely. As a preface, I should note that the concept of the affirmation trap that I developed, one of the sources in thinking through its logic was the phrase and the idea of cruel optimism, which is drawn from Lauren Berlant. Lauren's a friend of mine, and she passed a couple of days ago. So I just wanted to mention that and remember her briefly while we're together. And I'm thinking through this problem because a lot of my thinking is possible because of the brilliant people that I've known in my life. And Lauren is absolutely one of them.
Yeah.
So
great loss.
The Lauren describes cruel optimism as this way of being stuck in having to feel optimistic about the very thing that keeps on reproducing your conditions that don't change, right? In the optimism of believing you can get change from an edifice that in fact prevents change. I think in reading her book that maybe one of the main reference would be something like voting, right? Like we're told over and over again that voting is the only way we can change the world. And yet over and over again, it turns out to be the case that we vote for people who keep the world the same. But for me, the referent was really usefully labor, right? Which is to say, we're compelled to be optimistic about labor, or at least to go to work every day, because otherwise we would starve. And yet it's work that preserves us in the situation of subordination, of being at risk of starving, and so on. So when I started thinking about the affirmation trap, it's much as you described it, right? It's that thing of having to affirm by showing up in the morning, the very thing that keeps you subordinated and doesn't affirm, but negates you as a human. And that's true for each individual, I think, with work, but it's also true for the workers' movement in general. And that happened in very concrete historical ways. So as I said, the workers' movement had a lot of substantial gains, often through the strike over the century, let's say between 1875 and 1975. But in the late 60s, early 70s, industrial capitalism, global capitalism really, enters into crisis. Profit margins essentially vanish. There's still huge profits, but they're matched by losses in other places. There's no like systemic growth. And so overall capitalist profitability really plummets around 1972, 1973. And many of the major industrial firms in the US, it's car companies most famously, but there's other examples as well, face sort of an existential threat. They're barely making any profit, or they're generating a loss, and the government is propping them up because it can't afford to have these major industries vanish. And consequently, the unions find themselves in a very tenuous position, because if they bargain really aggressively and strongly, General Motors is just going to go out of business. And indeed, if the union wants its jobs to keep existing, that it provides for union members, it has to make sure General Motors continues to exist. So it has to bargain for contracts, not that sort of push General Motors around and win concessions, but that keep General Motors functional and profitable. And this is a huge transformation in the structure of organized labor in especially the United States, Western Europe, but other places in the world as well, in which unions, in effect, cease being the antagonists of industrial firms and start being, in effect, collaborators. And both of them enter into the task of keeping each other operative and functional. And that sense that there's a sort of historical struggle to overcome capitalism, that horizon starts to close long before the collapse of the Soviet Union. We often, date the end of the communist dream to 89 or something. But that horizon where the labor movement was pointed toward overcoming capitalism rather than preserving it, really, I think, starts to fade in the 70s.
Yeah, it made me think like the problems that you come into when you're like organizing workers from the perspective of like keeping them in work. So if you have like a miners strike or something, or miners are trying to unionize to get better benefits, but the mining itself is under question now because of like impending climate catastrophe, and like people aren't going to necessarily get behind a miner wanting to keep mining, right? Because it's doing damage to the earth. And so that's like one of those contradictions. And one of the things that keeps coming in my head, it came into my head when I was reading the book, and I didn't really have the language for it, but I keep thinking about it while we're talking. You're talking about the realm of reproduction. In a way, it's like, it's just life, right? Like the ability to live and to exist. And this is what we're struggling over. And both like Riot and Strike bring us, they're sort of an expression of the way that we are made dependent upon the market and state to survive, right? Like one is through work, and one is through having to rely on the goods that are produced through work to live, like consuming them. And so, like, I don't know. I mean, we have all this language to talk about the things that we have to do to live, but it's just about this question of living, right? That we don't ever get to. I don't know how to really frame that in a question. I mean, one thing is like, I think about like whatever work struggle we have to have within the horizon of like getting rid of work, like abolishing work as a relationship. But I don't know if you have thoughts about that, like how. Maybe this is like a later question too, like what's this like realm of living in relationship to struggle?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think as it was formulated probably a number of times, but best known to me is in a bunch of writing from the 60s in France by the Situationist International, right, was the goal to get beyond survival, right? That we needed to overcome survival as what our political horizon was. And in some sense, right, both the struggle that depends on negotiating for your wage and the struggle that depends on the value of market goods, the price of market goods, are both about survival. They're places where we draw survival, but neither of them is about overcoming the horizon of survival itself toward what you're calling like living, just reproducing ourselves without reference to some capitalist who's going to pay us a pittance every hour, or some store that's going to sell us, low quality pasta. And the goal is to get to a place where we can reproduce ourselves. Sorry, I keep falling into this technical language. I'm trained. It's unfortunate. To get to this sort of place where we can reproduce ourselves without reference to the wage or the market, and that's the goal. I think you raised an important moment, which is the sort of conflict now between ecological struggles and labor as a contradiction. We saw that really dramatically at Standing Rock, for example, right? Where, the pipeline company never says, you have to take down this blockade because we need profits. They say jobs, right? They say, if you shut down this pipeline with your blockade, water protectors, you're going to be putting a lot of good Americans out of work. And it becomes a conflict between, on the one hand, people who want access to the wage, and on the one hand, people who want to avoid total despoliation of the climate and the lands on which they dwell, and so on. And I don't think there's a way to overcome that contradiction. People try to sort of imagine, well, we'll have green jobs. That's the magic squaring of the circle somehow, is that we'll have an increase in jobs, but it will be good for the climate, not bad for the climate. And I think that's a bit of magical thinking, to be honest. And so I think that really asks us to get back to your question about getting past survival to living. I think that asks us really to think seriously about the zero jobs demand. A lot of, like, for example, socialists have full employment as a demand. Obviously, full employment, I think obviously, is A, not possible, and B, a guaranteed route to faster and faster climate collapse.
Right.
And moreover, work fucking sucks. I mean, I have a good job. I'm lucky. I've had a lot of jobs in my life, some better, some worse. Right now, I have a good job. I'm very lucky. And I don't like that job. I don't like any jobs. Work sucks. Having a boss sucks. Having to show up sucks. And showing up doesn't suck. Having to show up sucks. Mm-hmm. And, I don't think there's a route to planetary survival that doesn't pass through the no employment position rather than the full employment position.
Right. And I mean, just kind of building off that, like it makes me wonder, so like, all of these questions and struggles, like often don't get at the meat of the things. Like, we need to have the basic things to survive, which is like food and shelter and care of different kinds. And the struggles don't tend to be actually over those things. And it's hard to get out of the mindset that thinks about like some entity like the state providing us that, right? Which they certainly aren't going to do, and they never have. So I was just wondering if you had thoughts on that, like, because part of the dream of like the labor movement in the 19th century that we still have inherited today is that like full automation, the kind of like centralized state that controls everything, and we can sort of live our lives freely within that. But that obviously never happened. It doesn't look like it's likely, and all that the state kind of does is reproduce these forms of exclusion and surplus. So like I wonder, like, do you think that even shifting our gaze to those basic necessities as as the ground from which we can like think of life could be like approached as a kind of aspect of the movement without replicating those structures?
I think it could be, but I think that there are some real challenges and real warnings we need to heed. Certainly, we've seen recognitions of this need, but they've often happened in fairly small scale ways. In the United States, I'm old enough to have lived through hardly the first, but a sort of substantial back to the land movement, and sort of the forming of what get called communes, which is usually like, 12 people, one of whom has a trust fund, moving to upstate New York, and living together in a farmhouse. And I say that slightly mockingly. I don't think that's a bad idea, but there's a couple issues with it. One, it often doesn't legitimately detach from the market and the wage, right? There's someone who's still got a job or still has has inherited a lot of capital, is sitting in a bank somewhere and is living off of that or whatever. And so that's not a true form of detachment. The other is, of course, it's quite small scale. But the real blockage to that is, imagine, that started to happen with thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of groups, started to try and detach from the wage, detach from the market, and get into subsistence gardening and reproduction of their own communities without anyone working for a capitalist, without anyone shopping in the marketplace. What would happen then? The state would come for you. The state would come for you immediately. The state would come for you first by probably jacking up taxes really intensely on that activity so that you simply couldn't afford it. And historically, as we know, taxes were invented to drive people into the money economy. Right. And force people to live that way. And so that would probably be the state's first strategy, to force people back into the money economy, to force people back into the labor market, insofar as they're needed in the labor market. Which is to say, long story short, if people want to pursue this question of communal reproduction, I'm just going to call it a commune, but I don't mean, again, the household, I mean like large scale things. If people want to pursue the commune, they're not going to do it just by like withdrawing and it's going to be cool. It's going to be part of a sustained struggle with the state on behalf of capital. There's no route there that's peaceful, that's groovy, that like just like we're just withdrawing, we're gone. Like that's not going to happen.
Yeah, that's important. Yeah, thanks. That kind of helps sort of think about like why that still, we still have to struggle against the state who's going to interject itself in any kind of relationship we try to establish outside of its purview. So I kind of now, I guess, like, well, we've sort of moved to the current situation, but one thought and one question I had sort of thinking about the current moment in a phase of capitalism that makes strike difficult is how capital flight has worked, right? So we have technological advances that made internationalizing supply chains easier, but then increased the on-demand nature of modern production, and that creates more opportunities for choke points in the circulation. Two recent examples of this have been the Colonial Pipeline that shut off its distribution because it couldn't invoice the customers and bill them for the gas, but that ended up leading to gas shortages around the Southeast. And then the Ever Given cargo ship blocking the Suez Canal created a sort of crisis, and that was like also, that was accidental, apparently. It's not sure, these might not have been politically motivated in terms of limiting circulation, but they do point to issues of places like where we might think about struggle. So I was wondering if you had ideas about these kinds of circulation struggles from another perspective.
Yeah, in a way, I just want to hover over those two moments, the Colonial Pipeline and the Ever Given blocking the Suez Canal, just because they were such extraordinary moments. I'm glad you pointed them out. And it's true. both events are political, but that's different from saying both events were conceived of and executed with specific political goals. But they are extraordinary moments of sort of showing us vulnerabilities. Choke points is a very popular term, which I've sort of come to feel ambivalent about, but it's fine. But so I think they do point to sort of possibilities for struggle, but I think what they point to is not just the fact like, oh, circulation, capital is more and more dependent on it, which is true, right? The capital, as industrial capitalism has become less profitable, large firms have tried to really make their distribution of goods, their circulation of goods far more cost efficient. We've seen this massive build out of global shipping, especially since about 1985. Really dramatically trying to improve turnover time and cost per unit of shipping and cut down on those costs as a form of intercapitalist struggle. And those present or produce vulnerabilities. There's no doubt about it. I don't want to exaggerate those because capital is pretty resilient, just to use the technical term, right, which is pretty effective at having multiple routes to move things around, to be able to reroute, to evade a blockade or something like that. So I don't want to exaggerate how vulnerable capital is, but it's definitely a site of struggle, a site of contest. It's important to note that when there was the struggle to try and bring down the Egyptian government in 2010, 2011, so it actually starts with strikes in Makhala in the textile region. Then there's massive like riots and occupations around the capital in Tahrir Square, most famously. But the hinge event is the Suez workers threatening to go on strike. So that's at once a strike and a circulation struggle where they're going to block circulation through the canal. And that's the event that actually brings down the government, that precedes by 2 days the collapse of the government. So this is sort of interesting combination of phenomena. What's most important to me here is who this indicates as the subject who's involved in struggle. So if we say working class, I actually think that term misses some things. And it assumes people who are working for a wage, who go to work in the morning. Obviously, that's inaccurate because all of us do all kinds of work. There's reproductive labor in the home, we're doing elder care, we're doing childcare, all kinds of things, right? But usually working class sort of refers to wage workers. And the thing about a circulation struggle, the thing about blocking a pipeline is you don't have to be a worker, right? Mm-hmm. To shut down a factory with a strike, you have to be a worker and withdraw your work. So it really limits who can take part in that action to workers in that site, to the working class. Whereas shutting down a pipeline, anyone in the entire proletariat, which is not just the working class, but everyone who doesn't own the means of production, isn't a capitalist, can take part in that. Anyone can show up at a pipeline. As we saw at Standing Rock, we're like, any number of my students, right? I'm a teacher. Any number of my students were like, I'm bailing for a couple of weeks. I'm going out to Standing Rock. And I was like, Godspeed. And you can just show up and be part of it and take part. And that's, I think, what distinguishes circulation struggles is they're open as tactics of struggle to anyone. You don't have to be a worker to take part.
That's interesting too, because of like one of the brushes they use to tar the riot is the discourse about the outside agitator, right? So like the strike has a kind of belonging to it, like the workers belong there, and because of that like belonging, they have some sort of like voice that demands to be heard, whereas the riot can always be seen as like be painted that way, like that is outside, that it's not coming from here, that there's people who that's someone's neighborhood but not theirs or whatever, that is being demolished, or even if it is theirs, the people who are doing it are wrong. But like what you're saying with circulation is it's actually this like more open form precisely because you don't have to belong to participate in it. Yeah, I don't know, that kind of creates a different kind of space, I guess, for struggle.
That's really well said. I mean, I think you just did a better version of it than I did, right? But you're right? For a variety of reasons, the strike can make these sort of moral claims. I go to my workplace, I use the tools every day to make whatever it is I make in my workplace, and I have some sort of moral right of disposition over those tools. I can decide they're not going to be used today, that the strike is on. Whereas that moral right doesn't seem to transfer to the scene of the riot, the scene of the blockade, the scene of the occupation. At the same time, that space of, let's say, the blockade truly belongs to everyone, right? To go back to Standing Rock as an example, which I find very useful, it was led by indigenous people, water protectors, and rightly so, given their historical habitation on the land. But it was also open to anyone. Like that land, if we want to believe any of the promises we were made, even by governments, that land belongs to everyone. Right. And it's everyone's right to protect it, possibly everyone's obligation. So in that sense, the circulation struggle, I think, has a broader sort of ethical compass to invite people in that regard.
The Final Straw is a proud member of the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts, and here's a jingle from another project on CZN.
Silver Threads, Still Walking, Still Waking is co-hosted by me, Carla Bergman.
And me, Eleanor Goldfield. This is where we interview long-term organizers and radicals about their watershed moments, what they've learned along the way, and how they maintain their hope on this path, dreaming and building emergent worlds for a present and future anchored in justice and freedom for all.
Because there are forks in the road, but they all lead us home, to the fight, to the build.
You're listening to the Final Straw radio show, and this is Scott's interview with author Joshua Clover about his book, Riot, Strike, Riot. More about Clover and his writings are available at our blog, thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org.
Yeah, that sort of, I think, puts it in a really interesting and important way, because it maybe creates more possibilities of, like, solidarity, too. To think that, that your voice belongs there. But since you've brought up Standing Rock, I want to think a little bit about how you describe, like, the modern or current form of Riot Prime in the book, because you trace this back to a slightly different history than the earlier riots, to anti-colonial uprisings and slave rebellions, or that's like an additional part of it, a thread that comes into the play in today's riot. And you say that today's riot is always racialized, a question of surplus population. So I wanted to hear you talk a little bit more about the effect of racialization in understanding the riot, the way it's talked about, and then maybe, I don't know if you want to bring that into play with the uprising after George Floyd's murder, or the experience of Ferguson that you had, because that seems like a good examples for the racialization of riot.
Yeah, so this gives me a chance to track back to our very opening discussion about sort of the technical and theoretical categories. And I'm going to try and lean on them again, but toward this very concrete experience of racial violence, community defense, and things like that. So there's, I think, various ways of being excluded from the formal economy, as we say, the wage economy. One of the ways is sort of classic land dispossession. So we can think about indigenous people in North America being dispossessed of their land, and not always just to be brought into the labor force as workers, but sometimes it's just like, get the fuck off the land. We'll kill you if we have to get you to leave. You're not wanted. We're not even going to include you in the labor force. So that's one way of being rendered surplus to the economy. Another way of being rendered surplus to the economy is you work in a car factory that goes fully robotic to compete with lower overhead firms in Japan or South Korea. And you're kicked out of your job as you're replaced by automation, by improved processes. And so that's another way you can be sort of excluded from the wage and rendered surplus. So these are different kinds of surplus, but they're both super racialized, right? So for example, I talked about indigenous populations, that's racialized, obviously enough. In the United States, to choose a single example, if you're going to get excluded from a workplace via deindustrialization, Black workers get fired first. This is a long-standing tradition, even has to do with union policies of last hired, first fired. unions were very slow to allow Black people into unions, into protected labor. They tend to get hired later and fired earlier. So people who've been rendered surplus in that way are also racialized. But this is not just true in the United States. If you go to, let's say, both France and the United Kingdom, which the book also came in the wake of really massive rioting in France in 2005, 2006, and then quite famously the Tottenham riots in England in 2010. And these are profoundly racialized as well. You get large immigrant populations, often from the Mashrek, the Maghreb, in England, often from the West Indies as well. These are, again, the unemployment rates in those populations are inevitably twice as high as they are among white Europeans. And so those are people who, by virtue of being unemployed, are not in production, but they are in circulation. And that's where the riot is. So these riots of surplus populations are inevitably racialized in the West because of the ways that dispossession and exclusion are racialized, and dispossession and exclusion produce the population of riot. So they're always going to function that way. And then here's the kicker. Once you exclude people from labor, you exclude them from labor discipline. As you probably have experienced in your life, if you have a job, that's a kind of discipline. You have to be a certain kind of citizen. You have to show up in a timely fashion. You have to comport yourself in certain ways. The job forces you to be a certain kind of citizen. But if you don't have that wage discipline, what happens? Well, what happens is you get policed much more dramatically to make sure that discipline is imposed, because there's no wage discipline, so there's police discipline, there's state discipline. So these populations are far more subject to state discipline and to state violence. And that's what we see over and over again that kicks off the riot almost inevitably. So we look at the George Floyd uprising, and it's a struggle with the state, right, with the cops against the police, because the police are the instrument of this discipline. The state is the instrument of this discipline, and has to be, because there's no wage discipline. When you have very high unemployment, exclusion, dispossession, you get where jobs were, the police are. And this is always the case.
And also, just listening to you describe that history, it makes me think about why the riot currently takes on like such a bigger role than even seems more hopeful in a way as a point of struggle, is that like the previous iterations didn't sort of attack all the interconnecting parts of capitalism and the state, which relied on dispossession of indigenous populations and enforced labor by enslaved populations that became racialized. And if that part of it isn't addressed, like, we're just doing a labor struggle, it's never going to fully lead to a kind of like liberation, because we're still living off of those profits, right? We're like, whatever the fumes that are still exist from those profits. And so like once the racialization of the struggle becomes apparent, it seems like then it's actually being truthful in a way about where the enemy lies, or I guess, to put it in a kind of simplified language.
I think that's right. I mean, I do want to avoid a kind of anti-solidaristic account where like strikes are for white people, riots are for BIPOC, or however you want to phrase it. I don't think that's quite right. And moreover, I think that opens up the riot, the uprising, insurrection, to all those outside agitator claims like, well, here's the correct kind of person to be part of this struggle, and here's the incorrect person who shouldn't be party to it and who's just clearly an agitator. And I'm more interested in a possible sort of solidaristic politics. My experience of the George Floyd uprising was that it was led by Black proletarians, but it wasn't racially exclusive in any sense. And I think that efforts to paint it as such are counter-revolutionary.
Right.
And that it was an important moment of a always partial solidarity, which I think opens possibilities for the future.
Yeah, I mean, like the narrative, that I think was pretty generalized, but like in my area, when there was Black youth-led uprisings in the street in the wake of George Floyd, the discourse of outside agitators, white anarchists came in, and then the Black elder leadership also took on that role. But the fact of the matter in the streets was that it was a multiracial coalition led by Black youth who were innovating the point of struggle and talking about it differently than the people who had been kind of shepherded through the movements over the last few decades. But coming off of that idea of solidarity, and this is perhaps it's what you saw maybe in Ferguson too, you talk about it in a really important way, because there's the racialized surplus population that you just described previously. But I think a population that's rendered surplus today as production gets further and further withdrawn. So you're a teacher, I'm a teacher too, teaching the students in university who were expecting jobs after a BA, leave with no jobs and horrible amounts of debt. And so in a way, there's no pathway for integration, even for white people who were promised a place in this system. That just doesn't really exist anymore. So I was just wondering about how you might think about that, how that plays out on the ground, or how we can articulate that more explicitly to form bonds of solidarity.
It's certainly an interesting moment. We've finally, after almost 50 years now into national decline, have reached a moment where the possibility of national decline can be admitted. And the reason it can be admitted is because the consequences of it have finally arrived on the doorsteps of the white middle class, if we have to use the term middle class. I think we all know that's a deeply ineffective term, but we're getting to the moment where we're seeing declining life chances for white populations who never in the history of the nation have had anything but improving life chances, increasing life expectancy, increasing income expectations. And now we're seeing that moment where all life chances are starting to decline and diminish for that population of reasonably well-off, not utterly impoverished white people. And so we can now talk about decline. So the question is that population newly confronting political economic exigency able to enter into solidarity with the truly immiserated proletariat, especially the Black proletariat, brown proletariat, and so on? Is that possible? There's moments in which I do not have much optimism. You look at the data from the January 6th insurrectionists, right? And it's all not impoverished, but middle class white people, with a particular feature being they live in counties that either are or are adjacent to sites in which there's diminishing white populations. Right. That's a really interesting study by Robert Pape at University of Chicago, who does really useful demographic studies of things like this. So in that sense, if we want to talk about a downwardly mobile white middle class as a sort of significant demographic slice, the moment of January 6th is a moment of extreme reaction against extreme hostility toward proletarians of color. At other times, we've seen slightly more optimistic moments. I describe the Occupy movement, and again, maybe optimistically, I don't know, I think I should be allowed the occasional moment of optimism. I describe the Occupy movement as an effort, a failed effort, but an effort to find a solidarity or a collaboration between the downwardly mobile white middle class who just encountered the collapse of 2008, suddenly experienced vast amounts of indebtedness, as you say, really limited potential for future employment or advancement or anything like that, trying to find a way forward with already immiserated populations, especially Black populations, others as well. It didn't quite come off, but it was a try. One hope for the future is that can come off better next time. And if that sort of alliance, I don't know if that's the right word, but if that sort of solidarity starts to manifest, I don't know, I think it's on.
Yeah, I mean, you put it really clearly, what we're up against really is the recruitment of those newly surplus white populations from fascists and the like. And clearly that's happening across the globe. But the anti-fascist movements seem to be pulling out more people, at least right now. The George Floyd uprising was way bigger than the open up movements during COVID and then the January 6th, whatever that was.
Yeah, that's important to remember. It's important to remember the scale of the George Floyd uprising, which, you put together all of these alt-right, far-right, nativist, whatever you want to call them, movements. And, the George Floyd uprising dwarfs them. And that's really important to remember.
Well, thinking again about like sort of the global context, when you talk about the racialization of the riot, and in the book you are focusing, as you said, like sort of on Europe and the US, but in the current state of the riot, you describe how what was like a peripheral colonial conflict kind of comes to the colonial center, to the metropole. But I'm wondering how you see the kind of decolonial struggles continuing right now, and then how that might be tied in with like climate stuff and indigenous uprisings around the world.
Well, I do want to be slow to comment on this, only because I'm not sure I'm an expert on anything, but I did a lot of studying and trying to learn things for the purposes of the book and limited my field so that I could get some sort of handle on what was happening in the capitalist core. And I don't consider myself much of an expert on the rest of the world, so I don't want to sort of wax knowledgeable about things in which I'm still learning. There are people who are doing really interesting thinking about this. My friend Charmaine Chua, that's C-H-U-A, Charmaine Chua, who works on logistics, but she's doing really interesting work in relation to like logistics, decolonial struggle, surplus populations. And I try and learn from her and other people who are doing similar work. I do think, when I talk about colonial strategies coming back to the core, I'm not the first to mention that. Aimé Césaire, who wrote Discourse on Colonialism, talks about that exact phenomenon of fascism as techniques of colonial management being sort of adapted for Europe. And various other people have tried to sort of study this since then. And I think that's right. And I think it goes back to, Frantz Fanon is a really important moment in thinking about this. And I think it goes back to what I was saying before about the difference between wage discipline and police discipline or state discipline, right? So colonial management has not, in every case, but consistently been a form of police management. Fanon describes the colonized world as the world of the police station and the barracks. So the population gets managed that way exactly because you colonize people as an imperial power. You don't magically give them all nice paying jobs and they want to be good citizens. It doesn't happen that way. In fact, you're just kicking them off their land and managing them via sheer violence. And those methods in which you have to manage a population with the police and the army rather than with the paycheck are increasingly the case in the core. So that's sort of what I mean about colonial methods coming to the core, is that increasingly it's state violence as a mode of management. And I think that, remains true all over the globe. It's just that we notice it in these so-called high wage countries more dramatically as a change over the last few decades, whereas in lots of places in the world, it's not a change at all. I was just reading, George Manuel, who's an important indigenous theorist and historian who wrote a great book called The Fourth World. So he's from Turtle Island, what gets called Canada, but he makes a trip in 1971 to investigate indigenous life in New Zealand among the Memoriam and indigenous people in Australia. And he takes, very clear note of particularly the brutality and state violence meted out to indigenous people in Australia endlessly. So this is a global phenomenon, but I don't want to say much more than that because I don't want to claim any expertise where I don't have any.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate that. But the way that you put it in the book that really stood out to me was like helpful was that you talked about the difference in the early time of the riot was the state was far and the economy was near. And then now we're in a situation where the state is near and the economy far, even though we're like, if the riot is still in circulation and the market and consumption of goods. But what we're facing, we can't like attack the producers of those things. We're faced up against the police, which brings us basically back to that description that Fanon has of what the colonial experience is. And that in a way seems to me to be just a kind of, I don't know, in all my reading, it's like, this is where the state goes, right? It goes to, instead of a further subtilization of like discipline of the population, it goes to just like literal brute force to keep people in order. And that has to do also with like the diminishing returns of capitalism as a global structure of the economy. But yeah, I mean, that again, I guess it's good to not draw too many like, neat like comparisons or analogies among things, because it is different in different places, and the climate catastrophes that we're facing will make that difference much clearer.
Yeah. No, I mean, that was well put. That was, I think, a clear description. And it's a real challenge, right? I don't want to be fatalistic, but the switch where, once the state was far, police are a relatively recent invention, right? once the state was far up, the economy was near. You could go right after the merchant. You could go down to the baker. You could go to the grain merchant and just fuck with them. Yeah. And now, much harder to do. And if you do that, like, great. So you go down to the local department store. If you live in a place where there's a department store or a big grocery store, and you loot it, and that's great. I salute that. But even that's only temporary. You get some supplies that last you for a couple of weeks. That's not a revolution. And this is an actual problem, right? Which is to say, I think you have to fight the state. I think you have to fight the cops. I think there's no way out that doesn't pass through that. And I don't want to delude myself that we can somehow route around that moment. But you can't get locked into a ritualistic struggle with the state. I think we saw that like in Greece, for example, which, after the 2008 collapse, Greece popped off first. And for the classic reason, the cops shot a kid who was on his Vespa, and riots popped off, and they just kept going. And it turned into, I appreciate people who leave the house ready to struggle. There was a certain calcification where it just became sort of a march on the parliament, an attempt to storm the parliament, massive defense forces around the parliament building in Syntagma Square, squaring off. This happened sort of repeatedly. And, it's important not to get trapped in that moment. And you have to figure out a way to get past the militaristic confrontation with the state, but you can't route around it. So you have to figure out a way to get through it.
It seems in a way that they were in Greece were able to, or in Athens, able to create at least a temporary zone of somewhat autonomy in exarchia or something like that. And this is actually leaving that specific example behind, going to my next question just about where you're headed in your analysis, because the dead end of facing off the state is that we aren't demanding concessions, right? Because they're not going to redistribute. You say in the book, redistribution is off the table. And in fact, where the crisis for state and capital, the population is actually their problem. And we're not asking for anything. So what you say in the book is the next step is Riot needs to absolutize itself toward the commune. And you talked a little bit about the commune, but I was wondering if you had some more thoughts about, or your current thoughts, given the changes and what's happened, on how the Riot can produce the commune, which you say, I think this is really important, is a tactic and a form of life, not the end goal of what we're trying to achieve.
Yeah, so that gives me a chance to try and set forth a little bit of what I'm trying to figure out for the book I'm working on right now, which I hope to finish over the next, 9 months or so. Which is sort of specifically about this problem. Several of the problems you mentioned about the limit, which is the end of capitalist growth, its diminishing returns, but also the limit of climate collapse, and sort of those as two limits that we confront as we try and figure out what revolutionary struggle might look like. And I'm trying to think more carefully about the commune, not so much as what the Riot becomes. I think I put it that way in the book, and I'm not sure I love that formulation. But I think about what arises in some sense alongside the Riot. So I'm going to go back one more time to Standing Rock as a really useful example. So Standing Rock is not a riot, really, although there might have been a couple little riots in there. But it is what I call a circulation struggle, right? That larger category in which the Riot is the exemplary form. So it's a circulation struggle. It's trying to stop capital from circulating. It's trying to stop that oil from moving through the pipeline. But there's also the camp, right? Actually, there's a series of camps at Standing Rock. I think in the end, probably around 10 distinct camps. Each has its own name. They're almost all founded by Indigenous women. They have various sort of makeups. But those camps are what I would call communes, right? Not in the sense that they're sort of an achieved form, like here's our own self-government now this is how we live. But in the sense that they took up the question of reproducing the community, social reproduction, to use a technical category, right? Because if you're going to have that blockade for months and months and months, you have to have food, you have to have shelter, you have to have care, you have to have medicine. And the camp arises alongside of that as a commune. And what's vital here is that they're the same thing, right? There's no blockade without the commune. And there's no commune without the blockade. It's not like they're two different solutions that you throw at a problem. It's that they're indistinguishable. The care work of the commune and the antagonism, the direct antagonism of the blockade, are not two separate phenomena. You sort of choose your adventure. It's the same people doing both things. It's a single activity that has as one side of it the commune and the other side of it the blockade. And I think that is my real source of optimism, right? Is that we see those circulation struggles, which are inevitable. Again, I'm not saying they're good. I'm not saying they're bad. I'm saying they're inevitable. The structure that capital takes is going to be in circulation now, and it's going to have to be blockaded. And seeing that inevitable blockade, there's going to be more and more of those, arises in the form that's also the commune. This, I think, points toward a way forward, because we have to eventually get to that moment that the commune promises, without necessarily delivering, of breaking free from the things on offer from capital, the wage and the market. And that breaking free has to happen, and the commune is the promise of that happening and the effort to figure out how it can happen.
Yeah, I love how you say that. And that makes me think, again, like what I mentioned in the very beginning about like maybe some of the strength of the George Floyd uprisings came from the fact that people were doing the care work of mutual aid at the same time that they were getting in the streets fighting the police. And like, you know, thinking back to, you know, the way that people talked about the Paris Commune or even May 68 in Paris, like those are moments of lived experience that can then be drawn upon, right? Like of like something of another form of life, even if it didn't last and replace whatever. But like, yeah, if you experience being in the streets with people, that forms a kind of community. But I really like that you put the care work and the struggle together. That's something that I've been trying to wrap my head around too, because it dissolves those divisions of labor that were sort of imposed upon us by the state and the market, and the divisions of the spheres of life too, to say that there's work and home or something.
Yeah. So the thing I would add, right, is that mutual aid that was practiced during the George Floyd uprising, for example. So there's a bit of a challenge there, and the term mutual aid is a very common one of anarchists. And I don't identify as an anarchist, but like most of my friends are anarchists, and they probably all think I'm an anarchist too. So, and I would take it as a term of honor. And certainly in anarchist communities, the idea of mutual aid is a central one and has been for a very long time. But it's super important to me to think about all the activities that already happen in communities that don't identify as anarchist, yes, that don't identify as activist, but that are a mutual aid, right? There was all kinds of mutual aid in Minneapolis, St. Paul already in advance of people who understood that as a practice and had a theorization of it and had a commitment to it roll up. And I'm glad they rolled up, because I want as many people rolling up as possible there. But it's important to recognize that mutual aid as a practical matter already exists in those communities and it has to for immiserated communities of color to survive in the current situation. There has to be a lot of mutual aid being practiced all the time.
Yeah, I appreciate that. That's so important. I mean, it goes back to what you're saying, like you could call it a strike if you want, like whatever the terminology. And I think the same thing about anarchists. I identify it as anarchist strategically, but it doesn't matter to me. But the thing that even like, Kropotkin talking about mutual aid is that it's a kind of like spontaneous organization that happens. It doesn't need to be imposed by the outsider or whatever. It's what people do all the time. And that, I guess, like care might even be a better word for it. That going back to what you were talking about in the commune at Standing Rock.
I think that one of the things that's hopeful for me, I don't know how it is where you live, but in the Bay Area, which is my home, there have been moments when there's been a really aggressively contentious discourse that sets sort of care and militancy in opposition, often in gendered ways, but not always, in which like, we have a joke, like, look at that manarchist, and that joke about like manarchism, right, and militancy in a certain, but if you think about that example I tried to suggest of the blockade and the commune being a unity, not just two things next to each other, but a unity, you can see it sort of dissolves that opposition. And the idea that like, well, some people are committed to care as a practice and it has these virtues, and some people are committed to militancy and it has these virtues. I think that like, you look at scenes like Standing Rock, and it's not the only example, it's just an easily available one from the last decade. You see that opposition is overcome in practice all the time.
Right. I guess what I think that your book really helps do is to break through the like sort of like the false inheritances that we have from the kind of romanticized narratives of struggle and revolution that create those kinds of divisions that don't exist or didn't exist. And in that light, I guess, like, just to ask you like a final sort of broad question, do you have any other insights that you might offer into the current modes of struggle, or anything that you've seen lately as a kind of innovation that excites you?
Well, I mean, I think there's a highly specific and a highly general answer. The highly specific one is, the great US innovation of the last year was burning police stations. It's widely known as a global phenomenon, as I never hesitate to point out. On the first night of the Egyptian uprising, that I referred to earlier, a decade ago, 99 police stations got burnt. So that phenomenon is known globally, but it's essentially unknown in the United States, where the sanctity of the police and the sense of the risks of militancy outweighing the virtues of militancy are so powerful that sort of breaking of that barrier, so that was suddenly on the table. I think that's probably good news. And 2,000-3,000 Minneapolises. That's the specific one. The general one is a way of dodging your question, right? Which is to say, I think what's most important to sort of wrap around to the beginning is to understand why certain modes of struggle emerge. Not to say we should do this or that's good and that's bad, but to understand why people, like prescriptive accounts, like this is the right thing to do, I actually don't think are very helpful, in part because I deeply believe in the proletarian struggle. I deeply believe in people fighting for their lives and fighting for freedom and fighting for emancipation, not as an enactment of theory, but as where theory comes from. But you don't say like, oh, here's the right way to do it. I have a theory, and then you deliver that to people. Anyone who does that can f*** off. The point is you're attentive to what actually happens in actual concrete circumstances, and you try and understand why it's happening. And that's where I would want to end up, is on the team of trying to understand sort of the shape of history as it emerges, to understand what might be possible, rather than sort of delivering some prescription about the best thing to do.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm really grateful for the work you've done to sort of to illuminate those things, and I'm excited. I mean, I don't know if you want to share a little bit about your what you're working on now, because I'm excited to hear where you're moving next.
Oh, I probably gave as good a summary as I can give. It starts with the fact that we still have the same two problems that Aimé Césaire says in the Discourse on Colonialism I mentioned earlier. He says that Western civilization, by which I mean European civilization, has bequeathed us two problems that we have not been able to overcome, which is the problem of colonization and the problem of the proletariat. That is still true. We still have the same two problems. The struggle with those two problems now happens within two incredibly powerful limits. One is the end of capitalist growth. There's no more growing your way out of problems. There's no more increasing employment. There's no more capital accumulation to redistribute, to sort of buy the social peace. So that's one real limit. And then climate collapse is the other limit. So two problems, two limits. And those are the conditions in which we are compelled to sort of struggle for freedom, struggle to leave the realm of necessity and enter into the realm of freedom. And I think that looking at the kinds of struggles we see emerging, the things that I'm calling pipeline blockade, the things that I'm calling communes, and things like the George Floyd uprising, trying to think about these as ways that people are trying to figure out a path forward against those two problems and within those two limits.
Well, yeah, I'm really excited to read that when it is published. And thank you for engaging these questions and bringing it to bear on like what's happening now.
I really appreciate your thoughtfulness and your giving me a chance to ramble on a little bit.
Oh no, it's wonderful. Thank you.
And now some words from anarchist prisoner Sean Swain.
What you say, what you say, what you say, what? We'll come like a bomb!
Bill Cosby is free. His convictions were vacated by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court this week, and the decision forecloses on any chance of Cosby being retried. He left prison and went home, despite the credible, independent accounts of dozens of women who claim he drugged and raped each of them over the course of decades of his public career. Cosby started off as a stand-up comic with material markedly more wholesome than his contemporaries, like Lenny Bruce or Richard Pryor, who deliberately pushed the envelope with regard to decency standards. Cosby was universally acceptable to mainstream America. He was so acceptable that he became the first black lead in a TV series when he starred in I Spy in the 1960s. From there, he developed the Fat Albert cartoon series, and then, in the 1980s, became America's Dad, starring as Cliff Huxtable in The Cosby Show. The Cosby Show was particularly significant culturally and historically, as it projected a safe, stable, and integrated black American family into American households every week. The Huxtable family was composed of a father and mother, who were a doctor and a lawyer respectively, with 3 children who did not drink or do drugs or even listen to loud music. For people of color, The Cosby Show was kind of aspirational. For white audiences, the show reinforced the sense that America had transcended race, that the struggle for equality had succeeded, that there was no more work to be done, no more need for any concessions of power or privilege to anyone non-white. But during this decades-long career, according to the accounts of dozens of women, Cosby was using his own position and prestige to lure in women with prospects of careers and fame, then drugging and raping them, and counting on them not coming forward. He was, after all, America's dad. Who would believe America's dad was a sexual predator? He counted right, it seems. Cosby was not just a product of rape culture, but was a continuing beneficiary of it. He sensed that, given the cultural landscape where victims of rape were often blamed for short skirts and loose morals whenever they came forward, no one would report him. And if they did report him, they wouldn't be believed. Then the first accounts began to surface, initially as a trickle and then as a flood. Increasing numbers of women, most of whom not knowing one another or knowing details of others' experiences, describing how Cosby most often spiked their drinks with some kind of date rape drug and then sexually assaulted them while they were unconscious or unable to fight him off. Given the number of accounts and their consistency, and given the credibility of the women themselves, they can't be dismissed as gold diggers who bring spurious claims against TV stars. It is incomprehensible how anyone could claim that these events didn't happen, that Cosby is somehow not a serial rapist. So, no one really did. Instead of effectively arguing his innocence, Cosby's lawyers instead argued legalities. Most of the accusations weren't chargeable because of the statute of limitations, that the events occurred too distant in time. Lawyers argued that none of the victims barred by the statute of limitations could testify, or it would violate Cosby's constitutional rights. This is a doctrine called other bad acts, that it is prejudicial if the jury hears testimony of other bad acts besides those charged. Lawyers also argued that the jury could not see Cosby's videotaped confessions that were obtained in related civil actions filed by his victims, because the prosecutor promised not to use it against him if he confessed in the civil actions. Thing is, neither argument really holds any weight. There are millions of exceptions to the other bad acts rule, and prosecutors routinely parade witness after witness to tell juries of terrible uncharged conduct of the person on trial. Happens every day. And as for the prosecutor promising not to use Cosby's confession against him, cops and prosecutors lie to suspects all the time. In this case, there was nothing even in writing, just a verbal promise. So, those issues, all other things being equal, are guaranteed losers. Having worked in a prison law library, I can tell you about 1,000 cases where prisoners had better claims related to other bad acts and to promises made by prosecutors, and they lost. But Bill Cosby didn't. Based on those two issues, Bill Cosby went free. I think this is a commentary on American courts and on American culture. It shouldn't be surprising that courts behave this way, giving special justice to the rich and the famous. Former Chief Justice Brandeis once observed that the law is not fixed and stiff like a ruler, but is instead malleable and flexible like a rope. So much is left to judges' personal subjective application and interpretation. And even when higher courts set hard, fast rules, lower courts selectively ignore them. The Supreme Court makes rulings. It doesn't enforce them. So whatever the standard, lower courts do as they please. This makes it so it's a little less obvious that the courts pick winners and losers with subtle thumbs on the justice scales. As for what this says about our culture, by all accounts, a prolific serial rapist went home, despite credible accusations and even the accused's own videotaped sworn admissions, because of legal rules, not applied this way for someone not rich, not applied this way for someone not famous. This happens in a country where instances of rape are through the roof, where rape culture and the inferior status of women are reinforced at every turn, where networks like AMC still play High Plains Drifter with rape scenes where Clint Eastwood's protagonist gets revenge against a woman who slighted him by forcibly raping her. Women were objects to Bill Cosby. The courts have vindicated him. There's still nothing more American than Bill Cosby, America's dad. There's nothing more American. There's nothing more American than serial rape and special privilege for the wealthy elite. Happy 4th of July. This is anarchist prisoner Sean Swain, in exile from Ohio at Buckingham Correctional in Dillwyn, Virginia. If you're not feeling so patriotic, you are the resistance.
You can write to Sean Swain by addressing letters to Sean Swain, number 201 5638, Buckingham Correctional Center, P.O. Box 630, Dillwyn, Virginia 23936. You can find his past writings, recordings of his audio segments, and updates on his case at seanswain.org, or now follow him on Twitter at @SwainRocks.
And now a quick word about supporting the project. As with most episodes, thank you so much to the people that have been contributing regularly via Patreon or via LibrePay or via PayPal. Your ongoing contributions, again, help to support the transcription projects. Thank you again also to the people that are doing transcription work, as well as those who are formatting zines. Thanks to those who are sending the zines into prisons or who are doing translations. All that work is so awesome. We are really proud of the people that we have discussions with on this show, and the idea that they're getting into more and more places. Those conversations are being heard or read by people who didn't hear it on the radio or whatever is really edifying. That's a $5 word. If you want to support us, you can find us on Patreon at patreon.com/TFSR, where you can find thank you gifts for various levels of pledges. You can also find our merch at thefinalstrawradio.bigcartel.com, and you can make one-time donations via PayPal or Venmo. If you want to get us on a local radio station, check out the tfsr.wtf/radio page, and there are some clues in there as to why we like being on the radio and how you can help. And thanks again to all the folks who give us feedback. We do appreciate it.
You've been listening to The Breakup Theory. Check my stuff out over at causeShinyThings.com. Share and recommend this podcast to anyone you think would like it. I'll talk to you later. Bye.